On the fronts stretching from the Barents to the Black Sea, Nazi Germany and her allies had 217 divisions and 20 brigades, including 178 divisions, 8 brigades, and 4 air fleets manned by Germans. Owing to the absence of a second front, Germany was able to keep no more than 20% of its armed forces on the other fronts and in the occupied countries. By May 1942, the enemy had deployed on the Soviet-German front an army of more than 6 million men, including 810,000 satellite troops, 3,229 tanks and self-propelled guns, nearly 57,000 artillery pieces and mortars, and 3,395 combat aircraft. The enemy remained superior in manpower. We had a small numerical superiority in tanks, but in quality most of them fell short of the German panzers. On the whole, the Nazi High Command's political and military strategy for the coming months of 1942 could be summed up as the destruction of our forces in the south, the occupation of the Caucasus, a breakthrough to the Volga, and the capture of Stalingrad and Astrakhan, thus paving the way for the destruction of the USSR as a state. In planning offensive operations for the summer of 1942, the Nazi command had to take into account the fact that, despite its numerical advantage over the Soviet forces, it no longer possessed the resources to launch simultaneous offensives in all strategic directions, as it had done in 1941 under the Barbarossa Plan. By the spring of 1942, the German forces were strung out from the Barents to the Black Sea, with a consequent sharp decline in their operational density. By great efforts, the Nazi command was able to build up Army Group South to full strength and concentrate forces that substantially outnumbered our armies on the southwestern sector. Hitler's Directive No. 41 of April 5, 1942, envisaged the seizure of the Soviet Union's richest industrial and agricultural regions, acquisition of additional economic resources, above all Caucasian oil, and the capture of a dominant strategic position from which to pursue his military and political goals. Hitler and his associates hoped that as soon as success was achieved in the south, they would be able to thrust forward in other strategic directions and renew their attacks on Leningrad and Moscow. The plan for the Moscow strategic sector in 1942 was restricted to separate offensive operations for the destruction of the Soviet forces deeply wedged into the German defences, with a dual aim in view: first, to improve the German forces' operational position, and second, to divert the Soviet command's attention from the southern sector, where the enemy's main blow was to fall. A specific aim of the capture of the Caucasus and the Volga was to cut the Soviet Union's means of communication with its allies in the anti-Hitler coalition. In the spring of 1942, I spent a good deal of time at General Headquarters and took part in discussions with the Supreme Commander concerning various fundamental strategic questions, so I had a good idea of how he assessed the situation and the prospects for 1942. It was obvious that he did not fully believe the assurances by Churchill and Roosevelt that a second front would be opened in Europe, but he had not lost hope that they would undertake some kind of operation elsewhere. Stalin trusted Roosevelt more than he did Churchill. The Supreme Commander assumed that in the summer of 1942 the Germans would be capable of waging major offensive operations simultaneously in 2 strategic directions, most likely Moscow and the south. In the north and northwest, he maintained, the enemy's activity would be of little significance. At most, he might try to cut off salients in our defence line and improve the deployment of his troops. Of the 2 sectors in which Stalin expected strategic offensive operations, he was most concerned about the Moscow sector, where the Germans had assembled more than 70 divisions. With regard to our plans for the spring and early summer of 1942, Stalin assumed that we were not yet strong enough to develop major offensive operations. He believed we should confine ourselves for the immediate future to an active strategic defence. At the same time, however, he thought it necessary to mount a number of offensive operations in the Crimea, in the Kharkov area, on the Lvov-Kursk and Smolensk sectors, and also in the Leningrad and Demyansk areas. I knew that Marshal Shaposhnikov wanted to have only an active strategic defence, which would wear down and bleed the enemy in early summer, after which, when we had built up our reserves, we would be able to launch a broad summer counteroffensive. While generally supporting Shaposhnikov, I believed that on the western sector we should, in early summer, try to wipe out the enemy's Rzhev-Vyazma grouping, where the Germans held a large bridgehead and had concentrated powerful forces. After additional study of the situation, the Stavka and the General Staff reached the conclusion that the Orel-Tula and Kursk-Voronezh sectors were the most dangerous, since they harboured the threat of an enemy thrust at Moscow and encirclement of the capital from the southwest. Hence the decision. By the end of spring, a considerable portion of the Supreme Command's reserve should be concentrated on the Bryansk front for the defence of Moscow, and massive reinforcements were sent to this area. By the middle of May, the Bryansk front comprised 4 tank corps, 7 infantry divisions, 11 separate infantry brigades, 4 separate tank brigades, and a large amount of artillery. In addition, the front was supported by the 5th Tank Army of the Supreme Command Reserve, which would be used for a powerful counterblow in the event of any enemy offensive in this area. I was basically in agreement with the Supreme Commander's operational and strategic predictions, but I did not see eye to eye with him over the number of offensive operations to be launched by our fronts, because I believed they would swallow up our reserves without achieving much, and thus make it more difficult to prepare for a subsequent Soviet general offensive. When I reported my ideas on the subject, I proposed to Stalin and the General Staff, as I have said, that powerful blows should be struck in the western strategic direction with the aim of destroying the enemy's Vyazma-Rzhev concentration. These blows would be delivered by the forces of the Western and Kalinin fronts, and those adjoining them, and also by the air forces of the Supreme Command and the Moscow Air Defense Force. The enemy's defeat in the western direction would seriously undermine his strength, forcing him to abandon large-scale offensive operations, at least for the near future. Today, of course, when I look back, this argument does not seem so indisputable as it did then, but at the time, in the absence of complete information about the enemy, I was sure I was right. In view of the complexity of the problem, Stalin ordered that the general situation and the possible options for action by our forces during the summer campaign should be discussed once again. Special attention was to be devoted to the proposals submitted by the command of the southwestern sector, concerning a massive offensive operation with the forces of the Bryansk, southwestern and southern fronts. The aim of this operation would be to rout the enemy on the southern flank and reach a line running through Gomel, Kiev, Cherkasy, Pervomaisk and Nikolaev. The meeting of the State Defense Committee at the end of March was attended by Voroshilov, Timoshenko, Shaposhnikov, Vasilevsky and myself. Shaposhnikov made a very detailed report, which generally reflected Stalin's predictions. But in view of the enemy's numerical superiority and the lack of a second front in Europe, he proposed that we should confine ourselves in the near future to active defence. The basic strategic reserves should not be committed to action, but concentrated on the central sector and partly in the Voronezh area, where the General Staff expected the main events of summer 1942 to unfold. In considering the plan for an offensive operation presented by the command of the southwestern sector, Shaposhnikov expressed disagreement with this plan of the General Staff and drew attention to the organizational difficulties of the operation and the absence of the necessary reserves. But the Supreme Commander interrupted him. "We can't stay on the defensive and do nothing until the Germans strike the first blow. We must launch several preemptive strikes on a broad front and test the enemy's intentions. Zhukov proposes launching an offensive on the western sector and remaining on the defensive everywhere else. I think that is a half measure." The next to speak was Timoshenko. Having reported on the situation of the southwestern sector, he said, "The troops on this sector are ready and should unquestionably strike a preemptive blow to disrupt the Germans' offensive plans against the southern and southwestern fronts. Otherwise we shall have a repetition of what happened at the beginning of the war. As for launching an offensive on the western sector, I support Zhukov. That will hold down the enemy's forces." Voroshilov supported Timoshenko's view. I spoke up again in opposition to the launching of several offensive operations at once, but this view was not taken into consideration, and an ambivalent decision was reached. On the one hand, the Supreme Commander agreed with the General Staff, which was firmly opposed to a major offensive operation by the Soviet fronts grouped around Kharkov. On the other, he gave Timoshenko permission to carry out a separate offensive operation with the forces of the southwestern sector. The enemy's Kharkov concentration was to be routed by attacks from the Volchansk area and the Barvenkovo axis. The major offensive operations were fixed for May, but before that, in the interests of unifying command and coordination, Stalin ordered that the southwestern front be placed under the command of Timoshenko. I believed that we should keep the front commanders in command of their own areas of operations. The control of the fronts should be kept as decentralized as possible, since it would contribute to rapid decision-making in combat. In the event of the enemy launching an offensive against our troops, it would be better for the front commander to operate as he sees fit than to ask for the Supreme Command's permission for every decision. But the changes were made, and by the middle of May, the enemy began his offensive operations. The measures taken by the sector command are quite sufficient to repel the enemy's thrust at the southern front. The southwestern front will therefore continue its offensive. On May 18th, the situation on the southwestern front suddenly deteriorated. The General Staff once again suggested halting the offensive operation around Kharkov and turning the main forces of the Barvenkovo strike force to liquidate the enemy breakthrough and restore the position of the Southern Front's 9th Army. That day, I was present at General Headquarters during a conversation Stalin had with the commander of the Southwestern Front. I clearly remember that the Supreme Commander made it quite plain to Timoshenko that he was deeply disturbed by the enemy's successes in the Kramatorsk area. Towards evening on May 18th, he discussed the problem with Khrushchev, the Southwestern Front's military council member, who expressed the same ideas as the front command. The threat from the enemy's Kramatorsk group had been greatly exaggerated, and there was no reason to halt the operation. On the basis of these reports from the Military Council of the Southwestern Front on the need to continue the offensive, the Supreme Commander rejected the arguments of the General Staff. The existing version that the military councils of the Southern and Southwestern Fronts sent warnings to General Headquarters does not correspond to the facts. I can testify to this because I was present during the Supreme Commander's conversations. On May 19th, the situation on the southwestern sector became catastrophic. The enemy's strike force broke through into the rear of the Soviet troops. Only at this juncture was the order given to halt our offensive on Kharkov and turn the main forces of the Barvenkovo strike force against Kleist's armies. But it was too late. On May 23rd, the 6th and 57th Armies, part of the 9th Army and General Bobkin's operations group, were encircled. Many units succeeded in breaking out, but for some it was impossible, and refusing to surrender, they fought to the last drop of blood. General Kostenko, a hero of the civil and patriotic wars, the front's deputy commander and former commander of the 19th Manich Regiment of the 4th Don Cossack Division, was killed in these engagements. General Podlas, commander of the 57th Army, and General Bobkin, commander of the operations group, also lost their lives. I had studied with them on refresher courses for senior commanders. They were splendid officers and true sons of our party and the motherland. If one analyzes the course of the Kharkov operation, it is not difficult to see that the main reason for our defeat lay in the underestimation of the serious threat posed by the southwestern strategic direction, where the necessary Supreme Command reserves had not been concentrated. If a few reserve armies had been marshalled in readiness on the operational rear lines of the southwestern sector, the disaster would never have occurred. In June, fierce battles continued along the whole southwestern sector. Our outnumbered forces were compelled to pull back beyond the river Oskol and attempt to consolidate on the rear lines. On June 28th, the enemy launched offensive operations on a broader scale. From the Kursk area, he struck in the direction of Voronezh at the 13th and 40th Armies of the Bryansk front. On June 30th, the German 6th Army pounced on Ostrogozhsk and pierced the defences of the 21st and 28th Armies. The position of our troops on the Voronezh sector substantially deteriorated, and some of them were encircled. This is how Marshal Vasilevsky assesses the situation in his memoirs. The situation on the Voronezh sector deteriorated rapidly at the end of July 2nd. The defences at the junction of the Bryansk and southwestern fronts had been torn open to a depth of 80 kilometres. The front's reserves on this sector were thrown into the fighting. There was a clear danger of the enemy's strike force breaking through to the Don and capturing Voronezh. To prevent this, the Supreme Command gave Lieutenant General Golikov, the commander of the Bryansk front, 2 field armies from its reserve, the 6th and the 60th, ordering him to deploy them along the right bank of the Don between Zadonsk and Pavlovsk and to take charge of combat operations in the Voronezh area. At the same time, the 5th Tank Army was placed at the disposal of this front. Together with the front's tank formations, it was to launch a counterattack at the flank and rear of the Nazi forces attacking Voronezh. In the early hours of July 3rd, the corps of the 5th Tank Army completed their concentration on the south of the river Yelets. An immediate and decisive thrust at the enemy driving towards Voronezh could have changed the situation sharply in our favour, particularly as his main forces had suffered considerable losses, were extended over a broad front, and engaged in heavy fighting with our troops. But the Tank Army received no instructions from the front command. On orders from the Supreme Command, I had to go at once to the Yelets area to speed up the commitment of the Tank Army to action. Before leaving, I telegraphed orders to the Army Commander and the commander of the Bryansk front to prepare at once to launch a counterattack. Despite the massive support given by the Supreme Command and the General Staff, the situation on the Bryansk front grew worse day by day. This process was aggravated considerably by the defects in troop control at front and army level. In view of this, the Supreme Command took organizational measures to divide the Bryansk front into 2. Vatutin was put in command of the new Voronezh front, and Rokossovsky was sent to replace Golikov as commander of the Bryansk front. The 6th and 60th Field Armies and the 5th Tank Army took part in the fighting in the Voronezh area, and this somewhat stabilized the defense, but it did not eliminate the grave danger of a breakthrough across the Don and a thrust along the Don in the direction of Stalingrad. As a result of the loss of the Crimea, the defeat in the Barvenkovo area, in the Donbass and at Voronezh, the enemy again seized the strategic initiative, brought up fresh reserves, and advanced rapidly towards the Volga and the Caucasus. By mid-July, the enemy had driven back our troops across the Don between Voronezh and Kletskaya, and from Surovikino to Rostov, fighting in the Great Bend of the Don in an attempt to break through to Stalingrad. The forced withdrawal of our troops gave the enemy control of the richest regions of the Don and the Donbass, and created a direct threat to the Volga and the North Caucasus. We were in danger of losing the Kuban area and all communications with the Caucasus, the crucial economic region that kept the army and industry supplied with oil. On July 28, 1942, People's Commissar for Defense Stalin published Order No. 227. This order introduced severe measures to deal with panic-mongers and violators of discipline and resolutely condemned defeatist tendencies. It stated that the iron rule for the troops must be not one step back. The order was reinforced by intensive party political work. In June 1942, the party's Central Committee reviewed the state of political work in the Red Army and drew up measures for its further improvement. The Central Committee demanded that the political agencies should step up political education among the troops. All commanders and political workers, including the senior ranks, were instructed to conduct agitation and propaganda personally among the men. Analysis of the results of political work among the troops was improved. Better organizers were put in charge of this important and difficult work. Meklis was replaced as head of the main political administration of the Red Army by A.S. Shcherbakov, an alternate member of the Political Bureau and a secretary of the party's Central Committee and its Moscow Committee. Capable political workers who had given a good account of themselves in the active army were brought into the main political administration. Conferences of members of military councils and the chiefs of the political agencies of the Army and Navy were addressed by Central Committee Secretaries M.I. Kalinin, E.M. Yaroslavsky, D.Z. Manuilsky, and many other prominent statesmen and party people. The Central Committee required the military councils of the fronts and armies to improve their work among the soldiers and officers in order to tighten up discipline and strengthen the troops' steadiness and fighting ability. Communists and Komsomol members were specially mobilized. The influx of communists into the active army stiffened the morale of our armed forces. Prominent propagandists regularly visited the units that were engaged in the fiercest fighting. Above all, the Germans had to be denied access to the Volga. The Supreme Command set up a new Stalingrad front, comprising the 62nd Army under the command of Major General V.Y. Kolpachi, the 63rd Army commanded by Lieutenant General 6th Kuznetsov, the 64th Army commanded by Lieutenant General 6 Chukov, and also the 21st Army under Major General A.I. Danilov, which was made up of units from the disbanded Southwestern Front. The military council of the former Southwestern Front was transferred intact to the newly formed Stalingrad Front. The front was strengthened with the recently formed 24th Tank Corps, which took part in the fighting for the town of Stalingrad and along the banks of the Volga. The commander of the Stalingrad front was given the task of consolidating the defence of the Volga in the vicinity of the city. From the autumn of 1942, the Red Army had begun to create and train mechanized units. Many commanders were dispatched to study combat operations and warfare abroad. I was sent to the military academy of the General Staff. There I studied new combat methods, mainly the use of tank troops and airborne forces in a war of movement. According to the Wehrmacht High Command's Directive No. 45, dated July 23, 1942, Army Group B, shielded in the north along the middle reaches of the Don, where Hungarian, Italian and Romanian troops were being deployed, was to sweep forward and capture Stalingrad and Astrakhan, then consolidate on the Volga, thus cutting off the Caucasus from the centre of the Soviet Union. Support for this operation was to be provided by the main forces of the 4th Air Fleet, 1,200 combat aircraft. On July 26th, armoured and motorised German forces broke through the defences of the 62nd Army and reached the Kamensky area. To counter this breakthrough, the Supreme Command immediately ordered into battle the 1st and 4th Tank Armies, which were still being formed and had only 240 tanks and 2 infantry divisions. These armies were unable to halt the enemy's advance, but did, to some extent, delay it. Engaging units that were still in the process of formation cannot be considered correct, but at that time the Supreme Command had no alternative, as the routes to Stalingrad were poorly protected. Heavy fighting also ensued along the front line of the 64th Army, but the enemy could not take Stalingrad on the march in this sector either. Savage fighting continued through the first half of August on the approaches to Stalingrad. Our forces clung to their defence lines and fought valiantly for every inch of ground, launching counterattacks and wearing down and depleting the enemy troops driving towards Stalingrad. Given that the forces of the Stalingrad front were spread out over a distance of 700 kilometres and were experiencing difficulty in troop control, the Supreme Command decided to divide the front into two, the Stalingrad and the southeastern fronts. This was done on August 5th. The Stalingrad front remained under the command of Lieutenant General V.N. Gordov, who had replaced Marshal Timoshenko. His chief of staff was Major General Nikishev. The front comprised the 63rd, 21st and 62nd Armies, and the 4th Tank Army, along with the 16th Air Army, which was being formed under the command of Major General S.I. Rudenko. The southeastern front consisted of the 57th, 51st, 64th, and the 1st Guards Armies, along with the 8th Air Army. Colonel General A.I. Yeremenko was appointed front commander. On August 12th, the State Committee for Defence commissioned Colonel General Vasilevsky, Chief of General Staff, to coordinate troop actions at Stalingrad. Operationally, the Stalingrad front was subordinated to the commander of the southeastern front. On August 23rd, after many days of bitter fighting, the enemy's 14th Panzer Corps broke through near Vertiaki, and having split the Stalingrad defence in two, reached the Volga in the Latoshinka-Rynok area. The 62nd Army was cut off from the main forces of the Stalingrad front and had to be transferred to the southeastern front. German bombers made savage raids on Stalingrad, reducing the city to rubble, killing the civilian population, and destroying industrial enterprises, art treasures, and other objects of cultural value. On the morning of August 24th, part of the forces of the enemy's 14th Panzer Corps struck in the direction of the tractor works, but failed to achieve its objective. Armed workers from the Stalingrad factories took part in the bitter fighting in this sector. Simultaneously, the forces of the Stalingrad front, which had withdrawn to the northwest, attacked southwards and forced the enemy to divert considerable forces that had been assigned to capture Stalingrad. This manoeuvre took much of the punch out of the enemy's attack on the city. His 14th Panzer Corps was cut off from its support services and for several days had to rely on supplies flown in by air. Having ferried his main forces across the Don, the enemy developed a vigorous offensive backed up by massive air attacks. By August 30th, the troops of the southeastern front had been forced by the enemy's superior numbers to withdraw to the outer and then the inner defence line. The 62nd and 64th Armies manned the defences along a line running from Rynok through Orlovka, Gumrak and Peszczanka to Ivanovka. At that time, the 62nd Army was commanded by Lieutenant General A.I. Lopatin. He did all that his duty as a soldier demanded of him and more, since he was well aware that his army was outnumbered by the enemy. From September 10, 1942, the 62nd Army was commanded by Lieutenant General Chuikov. During this critical period, the Supreme Command launched various separate offensive operations to tie down the enemy's reserves and prevent them from being brought up to the Stalingrad area. On the Western Front, of which I was then in command, events took the following course. At the beginning of July, on the front's left wing, the 10th, 16th and 61st Armies attacked from the Kirov-Bolkov area towards Bryansk. In August, on the right wing, in the Pogoreloye-Gorodishche area, the reinforced 20th Army, in cooperation with the left wing of the Kalinin front, launched a successful offensive with the objective of routing the enemy in the Sykevka-Rzhev area. After piercing the German defences and reaching the Rzhev-Vyazma railway, the Western Front's offensive was checked. The Kalinin front failed to reach its objective, and the city of Rzhev remained in enemy hands. In the Pogoreloye-Gorodishche-Sychevka area, the enemy suffered heavy losses. To parry the Western Front's successful thrust, the Nazi command had to rush in several divisions intended for the Stalingrad and Caucasus offensives. The German general Kurt Tippelskirch writes on this point, "A breakthrough was prevented only when 3 panzer and several infantry divisions that had been about to move to the southern front were detained and thrown into battle, first to localize the breakthrough and then to counterattack. With 1 or perhaps 2 more armies at our disposal, we could have combined with the Kalinin front under General Iskonev and defeated the enemy not only in the Rzhev area, but the entire Rzhev-Vyazma German force, substantially improving the operational situation in the whole western strategic direction. Unfortunately, this real opportunity was missed by the Supreme Command. On the whole, I must say that the Supreme Commander realized that the unfavorable situation that developed in the summer of 1942 was due, in part, to his own personal mistake in endorsing the plan of action by Soviet forces in that year's summer campaign. He did not seek any other guilty party among the leaders in General Headquarters or the General Staff. On August 27, 1942, while I was in the Pogoreloye-Gorodishche area, where we were in the midst of our offensive, I received a phone call from Anne Poskrebyshev. He informed me that the day before, August 26th, the State Defense Committee had reviewed the situation in the south of the country and decided to appoint me Deputy Supreme Commander. Poskrebyshev warned me to be at my command post at 14 o'clock, in readiness to receive a phone call from Stalin. Poskrebyshev was a man of very few words, and the only thing he would say in answer to all my questions on this occasion was, "I don't know, I suppose he will tell you himself." From these words, I realized that the State Defense Committee was deeply concerned about the outcome of the struggle at Stalingrad. Soon Stalin came through on the HF line. After asking about the situation on the Western Front, he said, "You must come to General Headquarters as soon as possible, leave your Chief of Staff in charge of things, and think about who we can appoint in your place." The conversation ended there. Stalin said nothing about making me Deputy Supreme Commander. Apparently he wanted to tell me that in person. The Supreme Commander spoke on the telephone only about matters that had to be dealt with at that particular moment. He also expected us to be extremely careful about what we said on the telephone, particularly in combat areas, where there was no stationary coding equipment. I set off for Moscow without stopping at front headquarters. It was late evening when I arrived in the Kremlin. Stalin was working in his office, and several members of the State Defense Committee were there with him. The Supreme Commander said that things were going badly in the south, and that the Germans might take Stalingrad. The situation in the North Caucasus was no better. He then told me that the State Defense Committee had decided to appoint me Deputy Supreme Commander and send me to the Stalingrad area. Vasilevsky, Malenkov, and Malishev were already present. "Malenkov will remain with you, but Vasilevsky must return to Moscow. When can you take off?" he asked me. I replied that I would need 24 hours to study the situation and should be able to fly to Stalingrad on the 29th. "Well, that's good. But aren't you hungry?" Stalin asked suddenly. "A little refreshment wouldn't do us any harm." Tea and a dozen or so sandwiches were brought in. Over tea, Stalin gave us a brief report on the situation as of 20 o'clock HRS on August 28. The following day, August 29th, I arrived in Stalingrad and took command of the Stalingrad front, having first met with the commanders of the various armies, learned their assessments of the situation, and organized a plan of action. "You think the enemy will wait for you to get organized? Yeremenko says the enemy can take Stalingrad in one push unless you strike at once from the north." I replied that I did not share this view and requested permission to begin the general offensive on the 5th, as planned. As for air support, I would give orders at once for a total bombing effort against the enemy. "Very well," the Supreme Commander agreed. "If the enemy starts a general offensive against the city, you must attack at once, even if you are not fully prepared. Your main task now is to divert the German forces from Stalingrad and, if possible, wipe out the corridor separating the Stalingrad and southeastern fronts." As we had expected, nothing special occurred around Stalingrad before the morning of September 5th. At 3 a.m. the Supreme Commander called Malenkov and asked whether the troops of the Stalingrad front were ready for the offensive. Having assured himself that his order was being carried out, he did not call me to the telephone. At dawn on September 5th, the preparatory artillery and air bombardment began all along the front of the 24th, 1st Guards, and 66th Armies. But even on the main lines of advance, the density of the artillery fire was not great and did not yield the necessary results. The attack began after Katyusha volleys. I watched it from the observation post of the 1st Guards Army headquarters. From the intensity of the fire that met our attacking troops, it was clear that the artillery preparation had failed to yield the required results and that no deep penetration of the enemy's lines could be expected. An hour or two later, the reports coming in from the army commanders showed that in several sectors the enemy's fire had halted our advance, and his infantry and tanks were counter-attacking. Air reconnaissance had detected a northward movement of large enemy groups of tanks, artillery, and motorized infantry from the Gumrak-Orlovka-Bolshaya-Rososhka area. Enemy aircraft appeared and started bombing our formations. In the afternoon, fresh enemy forces entered the battle, and in some sectors our troops were pushed back to their starting lines. The intense firing lasted all day and died down only towards evening. We summed up the results. After a day's battle, our units had advanced not more than between 2 and 4 kilometers, and the 24th Army was still not far from its initial positions. In the evening, the troops received additional supplies of shells, mines, and other ammunition. In view of the information about the enemy gained during the day, we decided to prepare during the night for a fresh attack, regrouping our forces as far as was possible. Late in the evening, I had a call from the Supreme Commander. "How are things going?" I reported that the day's fighting had been very heavy. North of Stalingrad, the enemy had been forced to throw in fresh forces brought up from the Gumrak area. "That's good. It will divert the enemy's forces from Stalingrad." I went on. "Our units have made insignificant advances, and in a number of cases are still on their starting lines." "Why's that?" "Our troops did not have time to prepare the offensive, carry out artillery reconnaissance, and uncover the enemy's fire system, so naturally we could not neutralize the enemy fire. When we launched our attack, the enemy stopped it with fire and counterattacks. What's more, the enemy has had command of the air all day and has bombed our troops continuously." "Keep up your attacks," Stalin ordered. "The main objective is to divert as many enemy forces as possible from Stalingrad." The next day, the fighting was resumed with even greater ferocity. All through the night of September 5th, our Air Force bombed the enemy. In addition to the front's aircraft, the long-range Air Force under Lieutenant General A.E. Golovanov was thrown into the battle. During the day we repeated our attack, but once again it was repelled. During September 6th, the enemy brought up new units from the Stalingrad area. On a number of commanding heights, they had dug in their tanks and self-propelled guns and set up well-organized strongpoints, which could be smashed only by powerful artillery fire. But this we were still lacking. On September 7th, I was approached in the afternoon by Colonel Ruckel, Operations Chief of the Stalingrad Front. "The Supreme Commander wants to know if you have enough forces to defeat the enemy." In the hope that a transfer of some forces from General Vatutin's Voronezh front might put things right, we sent the following reply. "The forces available here are clearly insufficient for the defeat of the enemy at Stalingrad. Additional forces must be concentrated, so that a more powerful blow can be struck at the enemy as soon as possible." But the Supreme Command did not come up with any decision to transfer additional divisions. The third and fourth days of battle consisted mainly of artillery and air battles. On September 10th, after a fresh tour of the units and formations, I became even more convinced that we could not pierce the enemy's lines or eliminate the corridor with the forces available and without regrouping. Generals Gordov, Moskalenko, Malinovsky, and Kozlov were of the same opinion. The same day I reported to the Supreme Commander, "With the forces at the disposal of the Stalingrad front, we shall not be able to penetrate the corridor and join up with the troops of the Southeastern Front in the city. The Germans' defence front has been considerably strengthened by reinforcements brought up from around Stalingrad. Further attacks with the same forces in the same order will be pointless, and our troops will inevitably suffer heavy losses. Additional forces and time to regroup are needed for a more concentrated thrust by the Stalingrad front. The army's attacks lack the capability to overturn the enemy." Stalin replied that it would not be a bad idea if I came to Moscow to report in person on these matters. I took off for Moscow during the day on September 12th, and 4 hours later was in the Kremlin. Stalin had also summoned the Chief of General Staff, Vasilevsky. Vasilevsky reported on the movement of new enemy forces towards Stalingrad from the Kotelnikovo area, on the fighting that was going on at Novorossiysk, and also on the fighting on the Grozny sector. The Supreme Commander listened attentively and then summed up, "They want to grab the oil at Grozny at any price. Now let's see what Zhukov has to say." I repeated what I had said 2 days before on the telephone. I said that the 24th, 1st Guards and 66th Armies that had taken part in the offensive from September 5th to 11 had shown themselves to be efficient fighting formations. Their basic weakness was the shortage of reinforcements. They were short of howitzers and tanks necessary for direct support of the infantry. The terrain was very unfavourable for offensive action by our troops. It was bare and cut by deep ravines, where the enemy could easily protect himself against our fire. With the commanding heights that he had captured, he could maintain long-range artillery observation and manoeuvre his fire in all directions. He was also able to conduct long-range artillery fire from the Kuzmichi-Akatovka-Opitnoye Pole State Farm area. Under these conditions, The 24th, 1st Guards, and 66th Armies could not break through the enemy's defence. What does the Stalingrad front need to be able to eliminate the enemy's corridor and link up with the southeastern front? Stalin asked. At least one more full-strength field army, a tank corps, 3 tank brigades, and not less than 400 howitzers. Added to that, not less than 1 air army must be concentrated in the area for the whole operation. Vasilevsky gave my estimate his full support. The Supreme Commander brought out his map showing the Supreme Command reserves and subjected it to a long and careful scrutiny. Vasilevsky and I moved away from the table and spoke very quietly to each other about the need to seek some other solution. "What other solution?" Stalin asked, raising his head suddenly. I had never imagined Stalin had such a keen ear. We came back to the table. "Now look here," Stalin said. "You had better go to the General Staff and think out what has to be done in the Stalingrad area, what troops should be moved in to strengthen the Stalingrad concentration and where from, and also give some thought to the Caucasian front. Tomorrow we shall meet here again at 9 in the evening." Vasilevsky and I spent all the next day working at the General Staff. We concentrated on the possibility of a large-scale operation that would enable us to avoid squandering our prepared and half-prepared reserves on isolated operations. In October, we should be completing the formation of the strategic reserves. By that time, our industry would have substantially increased its output of the latest types of aircraft and ammunition for the artillery. After discussing all the possible options, we decided to offer Stalin the following plan of action. First, continue to wear down the enemy by an active defence. Second, prepare for a counteroffensive that would hit the enemy in the Stalingrad area hard enough to radically change the strategic situation in the south of the country in our favour. As for the specific plan of the counteroffensive, we could not, of course, work out all the details in one day, but we clearly saw that the main blows must be delivered in the direction of Kotelnikovo and the region to the south of Stalingrad, where the enemy was continuing to concentrate forces. In the evening, when we reported to the Supreme Commander, he listened to us carefully, and then came back to the question of reserves. "We have no reserves for the Stalingrad front. The General Staff has its reserves for other purposes. We are counting on you to think things through and give me a concrete proposal." "Well," Vasilevsky and I replied, "if it were not for the operations planned by the General Staff, we could perhaps transfer several divisions from there to the Stalingrad front. Look here, if we can't find reserves in the General Staff, it is because they will be needed for the future strategic situation. So what do you propose to do?" Stalin was in an unusual state of excitement. The plan he had conceived for breaking through the German lines had not gone through, and he had not been able to finish off the enemy either in Stalingrad or the southeastern front. In our ensuing discussion, we pointed out the very grave danger of the situation. "We can no longer hold the position, Comrade Stalin. The Germans are preparing for a full-scale offensive." Stalin fell silent and turned to Vasilevsky. "You will find troops for the Stalingrad front." The next morning we were working at the General Staff again. After long discussions, we managed to conclude the following plan. The 24th Army would cover the northern flank, and the 1st Guards and 66th Armies would undertake the main offensive from the direction of the Srednyaya Aktuba River. We were especially concerned about the difficulties that lay ahead. The command of the southeastern front would have to tackle the situation on its own and would need a free hand without outside interference, while we concentrated on the Stalingrad front. Stalin's reaction was calm. He seemed to agree with us that it was necessary to bring a quick resolution to the situation in Stalingrad. On September 19th, we received a report from the Supreme Commander about the German offensive around Stalingrad. On the next day, the German tanks and infantry units were deployed against the city in their entirety. I called the commanders of the armies together, and we decided to put into action the decision we had made at the General Staff about regrouping the troops. I made it clear that while it was not an easy operation, it was still feasible. On September 25th, we began to carry out the first stage of our counteroffensive. In a matter of a few days, the Germans were completely taken by surprise. By the end of the month, we had made good progress. On the night of September 30th, I was pleased to report to the Supreme Commander that the enemy was now retreating on the entire front. "Good," he said. "Now press on. We must not let them off the hook. Use whatever forces you have at your disposal." On October 1st, I called all my commanders together again and gave them instructions on the orders to follow. The following day, in a conference with the Supreme Commander, I summed up the results of our actions and reported the successful continuation of our counter-offensive operations. Turning to me, he went on, "Call up Gordov and Golovanov and tell them to launch air attacks at once. Gordov must attack first thing in the morning to tie down the enemy. You yourself must fly back to the troops of the Stalingrad front and study the situation in the Kletskaya and Serafimovich areas. In a few days, Vasilevsky will have to fly out to see Yeremenko on the southeastern front and study the situation on his left wing. We shall continue our discussion of the plan later. For the time being, no one else is to know what we have discussed here." An hour later, I took off for the headquarters of the Stalingrad front. September 13th, 14 and 15 were difficult, far too difficult days for the people of Stalingrad. Regardless of everything, the enemy pressed forward step by step through the ruins of the city towards the Volga. At any moment, it seemed, our troops would crack under the strain. But as soon as the enemy made a rush, our valiant men of the 62nd and 64th Armies met them with point-blank fire. The ruins of the city were turned into a fortress. But every day, every hour, our forces grew less. The turning point in these grave and what seemed at times final hours was brought about by Rodimtsev's 13th Guards Division. It counterattacked as soon as it got across the Volga. Its blow came as a complete surprise to the enemy. On September 16th, Rodimtsev's division won back the Mamayev kurgan. The Stalingraders were helped by airstrikes commanded by Golovanov and Rudenko, and also the attacks and artillery bombardments from the north by the troops of the Stalingrad front against units of the German 8th Army Corps. Full credit must be given to the men of the 24th, 1st Guards, and 66th Armies of the Stalingrad front, the airmen of the 16th Air Army, and the Long-Range Air Force, who rendered invaluable assistance without counting the cost to the 62nd and 64th Armies of the southeastern front in defending Stalingrad. I can state with full responsibility that but for the persistent counterattacks of the Stalingrad front and the systematic airstrikes, Stalingrad might have endured something far worse. It is of some interest to note what one of the German officers in von Paulus's army has to say on this point. At the same time, the units of our corps suffered enormous losses in September while repulsing the furious attacks of the enemy who was trying to break through our cut-off positions from the north. Our divisions in this sector were bled white. Most of the companies were reduced to between 30 and 40 men. During a lull, Yeremenko and Khrushchev visited the headquarters of the 1st Guards Army on the orders of the Supreme Commander. Golovanov and I were also present. Yeremenko said he would like to be informed about the situation and discuss the position in Stalingrad. Gordov and Moskalenko gave him all the details and told him about their views. Since the Supreme Commander had warned me to keep the draft plan for a big counter-offensive a strict secret, the conversation centered mainly on the reinforcement of the southeastern and Stalingrad fronts. In reply to Yeremenko's question about a plan for a more powerful counterblow, I promptly answered that the Supreme Command would in the future arrange for a much stronger counter-offensive, but that for the time being there were neither the forces nor weapons for such a plan. At the end of September, I was again summoned to Moscow by Stalin for a more detailed discussion of the plan for a counter-offensive. By this time, Vasilevsky was back in Moscow after studying the conditions for a counter-offensive by the armies of the left wing of the southeastern front. Before going to General Headquarters, we got together to exchange impressions. During the discussion of the situation on the Stalingrad front sector, the Supreme Commander asked me what I thought of General Gordov. I reported that from the operational point of view, Gordov was a skilled general but seemed unable to get along with his staff and commanders. Stalin said that in that case, another commander should be put in charge of the front. Lieutenant General Rokossovsky was proposed as a candidate for the post. Vasilevsky supported me, and it was decided straight away that the Stalingrad Front should be renamed the Don Front and the Southeastern Front the Stalingrad Front. Rokossovsky was appointed to command the Don Front, and his chief of staff was to be Malinin. Lieutenant General Vatutin was named as a candidate for the post of commander of the newly set up Southwestern Front. The nucleus for the staff of the Southwestern Front was to be the staff of the 1st Guards Army. Moskalenko, the commander of this army, was put in command of the 40th Army. After a detailed discussion of matters concerned with the plan for a counter-offensive operation, the Supreme Commander turned to me and said, "You must fly back to the front. Do everything you can to wear down and exhaust the enemy. Have another look at the areas detailed in the plan for the concentration of reserves and the starting lines for the Southwestern Front and the right wing of the Stalingrad Front, particularly around Serafimovich and Kletskaya. Comrade Vasilevsky must pay another visit to the left wing of the Southeastern Front for the same purpose, and study all the problems connected with the plan. After a thorough on-the-spot examination of all the conditions for the counter-offensive, Vasilevsky and I returned to General Headquarters, where the plan was once again discussed and finally approved. Vasilevsky and I signed the map of the counter-offensive, and the words "I approve" were added and signed by the Supreme Commander. Stalin said to Vasilevsky, "Without disclosing the essence of our plan, the front commanders must be asked for their views on future operations." I was ordered to instruct the Military Council of the Don Front personally on the character of the operations to render all-out assistance to Stalingrad. I clearly remember the conversation I had on September 29th in a dugout, in a ravine north of Stalingrad, where Army Commander Moskalenko had his command post. In response to my instructions to keep up active operations to prevent the enemy from taking troops and weapons from the Don Front's sector for an assault on Stalingrad, Rokossovsky said that the front was very short of men and weapons and would not be able to achieve any serious results in its sector. He was right, of course. I shared the same opinion, but without active assistance, the Southeastern Front, now the Stalingrad Front, would not be able to hold the city. On October 1st, I returned to Moscow for further work on the plan of the counter-offensive. The plane that took me from Stalingrad to Moscow was piloted by Lieutenant General Golovanov in person. I gladly joined this experienced pilot in his cockpit. Before we reached Moscow, I noticed that the plane was making an unexpected turn and losing height. I decided that we must have gone off course. After a few minutes, however, Golovanov steered the plane to land in an unfamiliar locality. We made a safe landing. "What made you land here?" I asked Golovanov. "Thank your lucky stars there was an airfield nearby, or we might have crashed." "What went wrong?" "Icing." While we were talking, my own plane taxied up. It had been tailing us, and now it took me to Moscow's central airport. Naturally, these flights in difficult conditions with hurried takeoffs could not always go smoothly. I clearly recall yet another air incident that nearly cost us our lives. It also happened during a flight from Stalingrad to Moscow. The weather was bad and it was raining. Moscow told us that there was mist over the city and visibility was poor, but we had to fly because we had been summoned by the Supreme Commander. We reached Moscow without mishap, but around the city visibility was down to 100 meters. Flight control radioed the pilot to proceed to a reserve airfield, but that would have meant being late at the Kremlin, where the Supreme Commander was waiting for us. Taking full responsibility, I ordered pilot E. Smirnov to land at the central airport and sat with him in his cockpit. As we flew over Moscow, we suddenly saw the top of a factory chimney only 10 or 15 meters from our left wing. I looked at Smirnov. Without batting an eyelid, as they say, he increased his altitude a little and in 2 or 3 minutes went in to land. "It looks as if we were lucky to get out of a situation known as being up the chimney," I said when we had landed. "Anything can happen in the air if the crew ignores the weather conditions," the pilot replied with a grin. "Yes, it was my fault," I confessed and shook his hand. Smirnov was a fine man and a very experienced pilot. We did more than 130 flying hours together. In October, by decision of the Supreme Command, More than 6 full-strength divisions were sent in across the Volga to Stalingrad because there was virtually nothing left of the former 62nd Army except for its staffs and support services. The Don Front was also given reinforcements. The Supreme Command and the General Staff showed special concern for the newly created Southwestern Front. The bitter fighting in the city and the adjoining areas continued. Hitler was urging Army Group B and the commander of the 6th Army von Paulus to take Stalingrad without further delay. As I have said, back in September, before the final storming of the city, the Nazi command had replaced the German troops on the flanks with Romanian troops, thus sharply reducing the efficiency of their defences in the Serafimovich area and south of Stalingrad. In mid-October, the enemy launched his new offensive in the hope of putting a final end to Stalingrad. But as before, they encountered a stubborn defence by Soviet troops. The 13th Guards Division under Rodimtsev, the 95th Division under Gorishny, the 37th Guards Division under Zholudev, the 112th Division under Yermolkin, Gorokov's task force, the 138th Division under Lyudnikov, and Belly's 84th Tank Brigade fought with particular skill and determination. The street fighting went on day and night, in houses, in the factories, on the bank of the Volga, in fact, everywhere. Our units suffered heavy losses and survived only on small islands in the city. To help the defenders, the troops of the Don Front launched an offensive on October 19th. The Germans were forced once again to divert a considerable part of their air force, artillery and tanks from the assault on the city and turn them against the attacking Don Front. During the same period, the 64th Army struck a counterblow from the south in the Kuporosnoye Zelenaya Polyana area at the flank of the enemy's assault units. The Don Front's offensive and the 64th Army's counterblow made things easier for the hard-pressed 62nd Army and thwarted the enemy's efforts to gain possession of the city. But for the assistance of the Don Front and the 64th Army, the 62nd Army could not have held out, and Stalingrad might have fallen to the enemy. At the beginning of November, the enemy made several attempts to wipe out the remaining centres of defence in the city, and on November 11th, when our troops were completing the grandiose preparations for the counter-offensive, they once again attempted to advance, but without success. By this time, the enemy had been reduced to almost total exhaustion. From the interrogation of prisoners, it was established that their units and formations were a long way below strength. The moral and political mood of officers as well as men had slumped, and few of them believed they would survive these hellish months of fighting. In the period from July to November, in the battles along the Don and the Volga, and in Stalingrad itself, the enemy had lost 700,000 men, more than 1,000 tanks, over 2,000 guns and mortars, and nearly 1,400 aircraft. The general operational situation of the German troops in the Volga area had also deteriorated. We have already mentioned that they had no reserves at corps or divisional level. The flanks of Army Group B were covered by troops of inadequate fighting efficiency, who had begun to realize what a hopeless and dangerous situation they were in. The Soviet forces on the Don were well placed to launch the counter-offensive of the southwestern and Don fronts. Counter-attacking on its own, the 51st Army had knocked the enemy out of the lake defile south of Stalingrad and taken a firm grip on the useful Sarpatsatsa-Barmantsak line. On Vasilevsky's recommendation, this area was chosen as the jumping-off ground for the November counter-offensive of the left wing of the Stalingrad front. The bitter battles for Stalingrad lasted more than 3 months. The nations of the world held their breath as they watched this grand engagement on the Don, the Volga, and in Stalingrad. The successes of the Soviet troops and their courageous struggle against the enemy inspired confidence in victory over fascism among progressive people everywhere. The Battle of Stalingrad served as a significant and testing school of victory for our troops. Commanders and staffs gained invaluable practical experience in organizing cooperation between infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft. The armies learned to combine the stubborn defense of the city with maneuvers on the flanks. Morale among our forces rose substantially, and all these factors together created favorable conditions for our counter-offensive. In mid-November 1942, The defensive battles in the Stalingrad area and the North Caucasus concluded the first period of the Great Patriotic War, which marked a significant chapter in the life of the Soviet people. This period was extremely challenging for them and their armed forces, especially as Hitler's armies reached the outskirts of Moscow and Leningrad, occupying Ukraine and leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. By November 1942, enemy forces had occupied a vast portion of Soviet territory, about 1,800,000 square kilometers, home to nearly 80 million people before the war. Many millions of Soviet citizens were caught up in the conflict, forced to leave their homes and flee eastward to escape enemy occupation. The military situation compelled Soviet forces to retreat far into the interior, suffering significant losses in personnel and equipment. Yet, even in these difficult times, our people and armed forces maintained faith in the possibility of defeating the enemy. The mortal danger rallied them closely around the Communist Party, and despite the hardships, the enemy was finally halted on all fronts. During these 16 months, enemy troops on the Soviet-German front encountered stiff resistance from both military forces and civilians in occupied areas. Their casualties were enormous. By November 1942, these losses exceeded 2.5 million killed, wounded, and missing. These were the Wehrmacht's elite troops, for whom the Nazi command had no replacements at the end of this first period of the war. Thanks to the tremendous efforts of the party and the people, Soviet forces were supplied with modern tanks, aircraft, and other equipment. In 1942, more than 21,000 combat aircraft and over 24,000 tanks were produced, and by year-end, the State Defense Committee had ordered mass production of self-propelled guns. The enthusiasm of the troops was bolstered by reliable weapons, allowing them to fight more effectively and achieve substantial results. The first period of the war, culminating in the Battle of Stalingrad, provided vital lessons in armed struggle against a powerful enemy. The Soviet Supreme Command, General Staff, and commanders acquired invaluable experience in organizing and executing active defensive battles and counteroffensive operations. Throughout the intense fighting of those days, the mass heroism of Soviet soldiers and the courage of their military leaders, nurtured by the party of Lenin, were evident. An especially positive influence came from the personal examples set by communists and Komsomol members, who, when necessary, sacrificed themselves for the sake of victory. The defenders of the Brest fortress, Leningrad, Moscow, Odessa, Sevastopol, Stalingrad, Kiev, Novorossiysk, Kerch, and the Caucasus contributed glorious chapters to this period. The first period of the war gave birth to the Soviet Guards. For mass heroism and success in the battles of 1941 to 1942, the Guards title was awarded to 798 groups, formations, separate units, and fighting ships of the Soviet armed forces. The intense armed struggle resulted in a massive expenditure of arms and equipment. Despite losing a substantial portion of crucial economic areas, factories, and mills, our people worked selflessly to supply the Soviet armies with the necessary means for warfare. By the end of 1942, the country had become a vast military camp. Soviet citizens regarded it as their duty to do everything possible for victory. The logistic services of the Red Army performed heroic work. In a year and a half of war, the railways transported 6,350,000 wagon loads of military supplies, including over 113,000 wagon loads of ammunition, about 60,000 wagon loads of arms and equipment, and more than 210,000 wagon loads of fuel and lubricants. The motor units transported 2,700,000 men, 12,300,000 tons of freight, 1,923 tanks, and 3,674 guns in 1942 alone. Military transport aviation moved over 532,000 people, including 158,000 wounded. The reorganization of the Red Army's logistics services at the war's beginning proved effective. The selection of commanders, political workers, and party organizers ensured close business-like contact with the national economy and efficient use of the tremendous resources supplied to the armed forces. Our young generation must understand the arduous struggle the Soviet people endured in defense of the motherland. Memoirs and works of fiction may not fully convey the experienced and powerful enemy the Soviet soldiers had to face. First, let's discuss the main mass of German troops, both officers and soldiers. Intoxicated by easy victories over the armies of Western Europe and poisoned by Goebbels' propaganda, the German troops were convinced of an easy victory over the Red Army and their superiority over other peoples. Younger officers and men, particularly those affiliated with Nazi organizations and serving in tank and air force units, exhibited particularly militant attitudes. In the initial months of the war, I had the opportunity to interrogate prisoners, and they genuinely believed in all of Hitler's promises. Regarding the fighting efficiency of the German officers and men in this initial period, it must be acknowledged that they reached a high standard in all branches, particularly in panzer troops and aviation. The German soldier knew his role both in battle and on the march. He was persistent, self-assured, and disciplined. However, after the defeat at Stalingrad, both officers and men lost faith in promised victory, and their morale declined, making it difficult for them to match the valor of Soviet troops. Nonetheless, the Soviet soldier faced an experienced and powerful enemy, from whom victory would not come easily. German staff officers were well trained in modern combat organization. Troop control during operations was primarily conducted via radio, and the Wehrmacht was well equipped in this regard. In battle, they showed persistence in achieving objectives and excelled in organizing air support, which often cleared the way for ground forces. During the initial period of the war, I was impressed by the operational staffs of the German armed forces. Their attacks were meticulously planned and organized. Experienced officers commanded formations and armies, and they often accurately assessed the direction, strength, and composition of forces for their assaults, targeting weaker sections in our defences. However, despite these advantages, the military and political strategy of Nazi Germany proved adventuristic, profoundly erroneous, and short-sighted. There were glaring faults in the enemy's political and strategic calculations. Even in 1941, the forces available to Germany, including reserves from satellite countries, were insufficient to achieve key objectives on crucial sectors. After suffering enormous losses in the Battle of Smolensk, the enemy was forced to halt the offensive against Moscow and adopt a temporary defensive posture. They also had to redirect a considerable part of Army Group Centre to assist Army Group South, which was engaged with our central and southwestern fronts. Having failed to capture Leningrad, the German High Command had to withdraw air force and panzer troops and regroup them on the Moscow front to bolster Army Group Centre. In October and November, the Germans concentrated their main efforts on the central sector, but the mounting Soviet resistance left them with insufficient forces to complete Operation Typhoon. At the root of all these miscalculations was the gross underestimation of the strength and vitality of our socialist country and the Soviet people, coupled with an overestimation of their own strength and potential. In planning the invasion of the Soviet Union, Hitler and his associates relied on overwhelming all their forces against the USSR, a reckless gamble. Despite the treachery of the Pétain government, the working people of France resisted the Nazi occupying forces. Likewise, the freedom-loving peoples of Yugoslavia, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and several other countries mounted a mass resistance. Britain also persisted in the struggle, although she did not fully leverage her potential. The Nazis underestimated the Soviet people, who, rallying around the Communist Party, reorganized the economy and quickly initiated mass production of tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. Everything the Soviet armed forces needed to gain the upper hand, reverse the tide of war, expel Nazi forces, and prepare for the complete defeat of Nazi Germany. The hardships endured by our troops toughened and matured them, imparting invaluable lessons. Equipped with the necessary weapons, they transformed from a defensive, retreating army into an unstoppable offensive force. The tremendous organizational and educational efforts of our Leninist party produced excellent results. both in military build-up and mobilizing the Soviet people to establish a solid material and technical foundation to support the Red Army's struggle against Nazi troops. In summary, the first period of the Great Patriotic War ended with the failure of the Hitler Command's strategic plans and a significant depletion of German forces. This result of the fight against the Nazi army largely determined the course of the entire World War II. In October 1942, it was clear that the Nazi command would be compelled to switch to a strategic defense along the entire Eastern Front. The Nazis had sustained enormous losses and were no longer capable of large-scale offensives. Their war plans against the Soviet Union were faltering. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda launched a campaign for more thorough and timely preparation for a second winter, campaign in the East, suggesting the enemy was preparing for a withdrawal, which signified a strategic retreat. The Soviet Supreme Command's aim was to leverage the situation and crush the enemy in Stalingrad. This required active and persistent efforts from Soviet troops. At this juncture, the Soviet armed forces began preparing for a large-scale counteroffensive in the Stalingrad area. They aimed to encircle and destroy the German troops trapped in the city. The significance of the counteroffensive operation was profound. It heralded the beginning of the great offensive that ultimately led to the Red Army's resurgence, including the recapture of territories previously lost in the initial months of the war. On the night of November 19, 1942, the Soviet counteroffensive began. The military might of the Soviet troops was combined with well-planned offensives, capable of breaking through enemy defenses and encircling the enemy. The battle for Stalingrad has gone down in history as a symbol of heroism and resilience against the Nazi threat. It provided invaluable lessons in cooperation, coordination, and the importance of unity among different military branches. The Battle of Stalingrad marked a turning point in the war, leading to subsequent victories for the Soviet forces. At that time, no one in the Supreme Command could plan for more, as we had neither sufficient resources nor means. Another conjecture is that on October 6, 1942, the Military Council of the Stalingrad Front, on its own initiative, presented proposals for a counteroffensive to the Supreme Command. Here are comments on that by Vasilevsky. As soon as day broke on October 6th, N.N. Voronov, V.D. Ivanov and I set off to the observation post of the 51st Army, where we heard Commander N.I. Trufanov's report. In the evening of the same day, at the front command post, we met the commander of the front and the member of the Military Council to discuss once again the Supreme Command's plan for the pending counteroffensive. Since the front command had no fundamental objections to the plan, that same night we wrote a report accordingly and sent it to the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. On October 7th, on behalf of the Supreme Command, I instructed the commander of the Don Front to present similar considerations with respect to his own forces. I believe no more need be said. The information presented by Vasilevsky is convincing evidence that the Supreme Command and the General Staff played the main role in planning the counteroffensive. Some historians also say that somewhat later, Vatutin, commander of the Southwestern Front, submitted his own plan. However, this raises some questions. How much later? What kind of a plan? A plan for his own front, or a general plan for the counteroffensive? After all, the Southwestern Front was formed only in late October, at a time when its forces had already finished concentrating in conformity with the plan for the counteroffensive, and the Supreme Command's overall plan had already been completed and approved. Here I would like to note that each front commander, in conformity with the prevailing practice and procedure for drafting plans for frontline operations, would necessarily submit such a plan for the approval of either the Supreme Command in Moscow or its representatives on the spot. The commander, of course, would also state his thinking about coordinating operations with his neighbours and what he needed from the Supreme Command. To draft such a major counteroffensive plan, a plan for 3 fronts at Stalingrad, it was absolutely imperative to proceed not only from operational considerations, but also from concrete calculations of equipment and materiel. Who could do this for an operation of such scope? Of course, only the authority controlling such large resources, namely the Supreme Command and the General Staff. It's quite natural that the Supreme Command and the General Staff, in the process of hostilities, thoroughly analysed all intelligence bearing on the enemy that the fronts and forces were able to accumulate and drew appropriate conclusions from both Nazi and Soviet actions. They also studied the proposals of frontline staffs, commanders of all fronts and arms of the service. After analysing all this information, they made one or another decision. Consequently, plans for an operation of strategic scope could be fully conceived only as the upshot of protracted efforts by all the fighting arms, staffs, and commanders. I would like to reiterate that the Supreme Command and the General Staff unquestionably played the decisive role in planning and effecting the counteroffensive at Stalingrad. There is also no doubt that credit for directly smashing the enemy goes to those who, by their brave assault, accurate fire, courage, valour, and skill, blasted the enemy to smithereens. They were the valiant troops, commanders, and generals who had passed the grim trials of the initial part of the war with flying colours, and, on the eve of the counteroffensive, were fully prepared to take the initiative and deal the enemy a deadly blow. The Supreme Command and the General Staff deserve credit for their ability to analyse with scientific accuracy all the factors involved in this enormous operation and predict its progress and final result. Therefore, it is out of the question to attribute this counteroffensive to any particular individual. I do not think it necessary to describe in detail the entire plan for the counteroffensive and the progress of the operation, since our historians have written much on the subject, and most of it is accurate. There are some points, however, that I feel are worthwhile discussing. The dominant role in the initial phase of the counteroffensive was played by the Southwestern Front, commanded by Lieutenant General N.F. Delivering crippling, deep-thrusting blows, this front struck out from bridgeheads in the vicinity of Serafimovich and Kletskaya on the right bank of the Don. Meanwhile, the Stalingrad front was advancing from the Sarpinskaya Lakes area. The shock groupings of the two fronts were to link up in the area between Kalach on the Don, and the small village of Sovetski, thus completing the encirclement of the main enemy grouping at Stalingrad. Deploying its central grouping, which incorporated, among other troops, the 21st Army, the 5th Tank Army, and part of the 1st Guards Army, along with other strong forces from bridgeheads southwest of Serafimovich and in the vicinity of Kletskaya, the southwestern front was to pierce the defence line of the 3rd Romanian Army and, with its mobile formations, race southeast to reach the Don in the area of Bolshanabatovskaya and Kalach. As a result of this thrust, the forces of this front were to emerge in the rear of the Nazi grouping at Stalingrad and block all westward lines of retreat. The mission of supporting the front's shock group and establishing the outer perimeter of encirclement in the southwest and west was assigned to the army operating on the right flank of the southwestern front, the 1st Guards Army under Lieutenant General D.D. Lelyushenko, and subsequently to the 5th Tank Army under Lieutenant General P.L. Romanenko. Thrusting forward in a western, southwestern and southern direction on the 3rd day of the operation, these forces were supposed to reach the line stretching from Veshenskaya to Bokovskaya, and farther out along the river Chir to Oblivskaya. Ground operations along the southwestern front were to be supported by the 2nd and 17th Air Armies under Major Generals K.N. Smirnov and S.A. Krasovsky. Meanwhile, the Don front was to deliver two secondary attacks. One was to be combined with the southwestern front, and thrusting southeast from east of Kletskaya, smash enemy defences on the Don's right bank. This was to be effected by the 65th Army. The other was to thrust out from the area of Kashalinskaya along the left bank of the Don and southwards in the general direction of Vertiaki, to cut off enemy forces operating in the Don's smaller loop from the Stalingrad grouping. This was to be effected by the 24th Army. The 66th Army was to go into vigorous action north of Stalingrad to tie up the enemy and completely prevent him from manoeuvring with reserve forces. The ground forces of the Don front were to be supported by the 16th Air Army under Major General S.I. Rudenko. The shock grouping of the Stalingrad front, comprised of the 51st, 57th and 64th Armies, was to launch an offensive on the line extending from Ivanovka to the northern tip of Lake Barmantsak. Its mission was to pierce enemy defences and, advancing in a northwesterly direction, reach the vicinity of Kalach and the small village of Sovetsky, where it was to link up with the forces of the southwestern front and thus seal the encirclement of the enemy grouping at Stalingrad. The 51st Army under Major General Trufanov was to break enemy defences on the isthmuses between Lakes Sapa, Tsatsa and Barmantsak, concentrating forces to carry the offensive farther northwest in the general direction of Abganerovo. Meanwhile, the 57th Army under General F.I. Tolbukin and the 64th Army under General M.S. Shumilov were to attack westwards and northwest from the vicinity of Ivanovka to envelop the enemy grouping from the south. The 62nd Army under General Sykes-Chuikov was to pin down enemy forces by action inside the city and be prepared to launch an offensive.